The night before the waters began their slow and ancient rise, I found myself awake long before the first hint of dawn. Our house, built of sun-dried mud brick and softened by years of touch and weather, held the night's gentle warmth in its walls. I lay still on my woven reed mat, listening to the deep quiet that settled over everything. Even the insects, so often humming in the warm months, seemed subdued, as though they too sensed the nearness of the river's awakening. A faint breeze drifted through the small opening near the roof and carried with it the earthy smell of the Nile's banks. I remember that morning clearly, though it was not marked by anything dramatic or loud. It began as so many mornings in the flood season began, with a softness in the air and a pale wash of light slipping gently over the mud brick walls of our village. I woke on my mat to the faint sounds of the Nile in the distance and the quiet breathing of my wife and children nearby. The door was still barred, and the coolness inside the house still clung to the shadows in the corners. For a few moments, I lay there, listening. The second day of Ak had begun, and already the river had inched a little higher. I could feel it without seeing it, in the moisture that settled on the air, in the slightly heavier scent of silt and water drifting in on the breeze. The inundation was like the slow turning of a great wheel, so gradual that one might miss its movement if one did not pay attention. But I had spent my whole life watching it, and my father before me, and his father before him. To us, the river's breath was as familiar as our own. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and listened for any movement in the house. My wife lay still, her face relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the mat. My son's foot had slipped free of his cover, and I reached over to pull the linen back over him, smiling to myself at the way he always managed to turn sideways in his sleep. My daughter's mat was empty, that did not surprise me. Merritt had always been drawn to the quiet of early morning, even as a child. I often found her near the river at dawn, watching the first changes on its surface, as if listening for something only she could hear. I rose quietly and crossed the room, lifting the wooden bar from the door. Outside, the air greeted me with a light caress. The sky in the east was beginning to brighten, though the sun itself had not yet shown its full face. A few neighbors were already awake, figures moving in the half-light, drawing water, stoking small fires, adjusting the positions of stored jars. The village felt both hushed and alive, as if holding a low, steady murmur of expectation. I stepped out into the open, stretching my arms slowly, feeling the stiffness of sleep release its grip on my muscles. The earth beneath my bare feet was cool and firm. A thin mist hovered above the lower ground toward the river, blurring the shapes of reeds and distant palms. I knew that by the time the sun was fully risen, the mist would be gone, leaving behind only its memory and the glistening traces of moisture on grass and stone. I decided to walk down to the riverbank before the village fully woke. It was my habit each year during Ak to observe the water daily, to watch the way it traced new lines along the shore, to see how it leaned into the fields and how the fields accepted it. The flood was not something to be measured only by the priests in their formal readings, it was also a living experience, day by day, under one's own feet and before one's own eyes. As I made my way along the familiar path, I nodded to a man leading a sleepy donkey toward the storage sheds. He raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement. A woman carrying a basket of herbs walked in the opposite direction, her steps slow and balanced. Our exchanges were brief, but they carried an unspoken understanding. We all shared the same awareness of the season, the same quiet vigilance. When I reached the river, I paused and took a deep breath. The Nile spread before me, broad and calm, its surface tinted with the soft colors of dawn. Already I could see the difference from the day before. The water had crept farther up the bank, covering stones that had been visible only yesterday, lapping gently at the base of reeds that had previously stood on dry ground. Simple markers set by our elders, a line of stones, a low peg, now touched the edge of the rising water. I stepped closer, stopping just short of where the mud grew slick. The river's voice was a gentle murmur, a subtle mix of ripples and small eddies turning around bits of drift. I watched as a thin branch floated past, carried along at a patient pace. Somewhere far upriver, rains had poured onto distant hills and filled channels that fed the source of this great current. We never saw those rains, yet they spoke to us through the height and color of the water at our feet. Kneeling, I cupped my hands and dipped them into the river. The coolness seeped into my skin, bringing with it the faint, earthy scent of mixed silt and distant lands. I let the water slip back through my fingers in thin streams. It was always humbling, feeling that vast movement pass effortlessly around such a small gesture. Behind me, I heard light footsteps approaching. I turned my head and saw Merritt, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her expression thoughtful but serene. She had the same look I remembered from when she was a girl, quiet eyes that seemed to notice details others might pass without comment. "You came early again," I said, my voice soft so as not to disturb the stillness. She nodded and joined me at the edge of the bank. "I wanted to see how far it has come," she answered. "It feels different this year. I don't know how to say it. Just, fuller." I smiled faintly. "You are learning to read the river. That is good. It will serve you well." We stood there together for a while, not speaking, simply watching. The sun began to emerge more fully, its light stretching across the water in a growing path of gold. Birds took flight from the reeds, their silhouettes passing in front of the brightening sky. Their calls rang out briefly, then folded into the soft murmurs of the morning. After some time, we turned back toward the village. The day was beginning in earnest now. Children's voices rose as they woke. The sound of grinding stones floated through the air as women prepared the first bread. Men's footsteps grew more frequent along the path, some heading toward storage areas, others toward the banks to check on the progress of the flood. At home, my wife was awake and tending to the hearth. The smell of warm bread greeted us as we stepped inside. My son sat cross-legged near her, rubbing a piece of clay between his hands, shaping it absent-mindedly as he spoke about a dream he'd had. I listened for a moment. The dream was about a fish that had grown wings and flown above the reeds, absurd and harmless. We ate our morning meal together, the four of us sitting close. The bread was soft and still warm, and the water in our jar tasted faintly of the coolness from last night's air. Afterward, my wife began tidying the house while Merritt helped her, and my son followed me outside to see what I was doing. The flood season meant fewer hours in the fields and more time maintaining tools, checking walls, and helping strengthen the paths that rose above the soon-to-be flooded ground. As we walked together, my son matched his smaller steps to mine. He looked up at me, sunlight catching in his hair. "Will the water come all the way to the village this year?" he asked. "Not if the river is as balanced as it seems," I answered. "It will come close, but our fathers learned long ago where to build. The land slopes gently. The fields drink first." He frowned slightly, thinking this over. "How did they know where to build?" "By watching," I said. "By listening to the river, to the wind, to the shape of the land beneath their feet. Many seasons, many floods. They learned slowly. We stand on what they learned." My son nodded, satisfied, though I could tell he was still thinking. We reached one of the raised paths that edged the fields and began inspecting it. In some places, the earth had cracked in the previous dry season and needed to be smoothed and reinforced. We worked side by side, pressing new mud into place, firming it with our hands and the flat backs of small wooden tools. The mud was cool and pliant at first, then warmed slightly as the sun touched it. From our vantage point, I could see the water creeping farther into the low-lying fields. It moved with unhurried certainty, filling the shallow depressions and sliding along gentle slopes. The plants that had remained, stems of cut grain, roots, small patches of grass, now stood in the water, their reflections bending and wavering with each tiny movement of the surface. As we worked, other villagers passed by. One of the older men, Beck, stopped to exchange a few words. "It looks promising," he said, nodding toward the water. His face was weathered, his hair mostly gone, but his eyes remained sharp. "Not too fast, not too low." "Yes," I agreed. "If it continues like this, the soil will be rich." He smiled slightly. "The river is in a generous mood. Let us hope it stays that way." He continued on his way, his staff tapping lightly against the packed earth of the path. I watched him for a moment, thinking of how many flood seasons he must have seen. The lines on his face were like markings in clay, evidence of years of sun, wind, and work. By midday, the sun was high and the air had grown warmer, though not yet uncomfortably so. We returned to the village for the meal. Under the shade of a small fig tree in our courtyard, we ate bread dipped in oil, along with lentils flavored with garlic and herbs my wife had dried earlier in the year. The tree's leaves cast a shifting pattern of shadow and light on the ground, and a cool breeze made them tremble softly. After eating, I rested my back against the wall and let my eyes close for a brief moment. The sounds of the village flowed around me, the murmur of conversation, the distant splash of water where someone washed clothes, the occasional bleat of a goat tethered in the shade. None of it was sharp or demanding. It was a gentle, familiar tapestry of daily life. When I opened my eyes again, Merritt was sitting nearby, smoothing the edges of the reed mat she had been weaving. My son had found a small group of other children and was showing them how to shape tiny boats from leftover clay, their small hands working enthusiastically. The afternoon brought more quiet tasks. Some men inspected the outer walls of granaries, making sure they were solid enough to protect against the damp rising air. Others checked roof edges and cleaned out drainage channels in the village's slightly lower lanes. I joined a small group walking along one of the broader paths that connected our houses, helping to clear stones and debris so that once the water had fully risen, we could move more easily along the safer, higher ground. The work was not rushed. We spoke in low tones as we moved, simple comments about the year's weather, small recollections of past floods, gentle hopes for the coming planting. The sky above us remained bright but soft, its blue deepening as the sun drifted westward. In the distance, I saw the glint of sunlight on water spreading more widely now, turning much of the floodplain into a continuous sheet that reflected the sky. Toward late afternoon, I walked again to one of my favorite overlooks, a small rise where the land lifted itself just enough that one could see both the village and the expanding waters beyond. From there, the houses looked like quiet, sturdy shapes, each one holding a small world of its own. The water lay beyond them like an enormous mirror, broken only by the occasional palm, the trunks rising straight out of the shimmering surface. A pair of pelicans glided slowly above the water, their wings moving in calm, measured strokes. I watched their reflection glide along with them, slightly distorted by the faint ripples. Somewhere nearby, a frog called, followed by another, then another, until a chorus had built up, distant but continuous. Their voices signaled that the inundation was truly underway, that the land and water had reached their yearly agreement once more. The light softened as the day drew toward evening. Colors shifted from gold to orange, then to the first hints of rose and violet. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin strands, curling gently in the still, warm air. The village's bustle eased, replaced by slower movements as people finished their tasks and turned toward their evening meals. I made my way back home, feeling a peaceful fatigue in my limbs, the kind that came from a day spent walking, working, watching. My wife greeted me with a quiet smile, and we sat together with our children, sharing a simple stew and more bread. As we ate, my son spoke of the boats he and the other children had set to float in the shallow edges of the flood, and Merritt described how the mat she was weaving would be placed near the doorway to catch dust and moisture when the planting season came. Their words blended with the smell of the stew, the warmth of the food, and the glow of the small oil lamp near the wall. Outside, the sky darkened steadily, and the first stars appeared once again above the valley. Later, when the house had grown quiet and my family was resting, I stepped outside for one last look at the night. The village lay under a calm, dark dome of sky. The river, though no longer visible in detail from where I stood, announced itself through the cool breath that drifted over the land and the faint, steady murmur that carried through the stillness. I lifted my eyes to the stars. One bright one near the eastern horizon was rising higher than before, a signal the priests said matched the heart of the flood. I did not know all their calculations, but I had learned to trust the ways in which the sky's rhythm matched the river's. Standing there, with my feet on the firm earth of the village and the damp breath of the Nile brushing my face, I felt held between two great, patient presences, the land and the water, both older than any human memory, both endlessly repeating their quiet exchanges. We, in our small houses, with our jars and mats and tools, simply learned to live within that exchange, to listen and adjust, to give thanks and adapt when needed. The night wrapped itself around me gently. The fatigue in my body deepened, softening into a pleasant heaviness. I returned inside, lay down on my mat, and closed my eyes, the faint murmurs of the river blending into my breathing. Sleep came gradually, like the rising of the waters themselves, slow, sure, and complete. And in the days that followed, the river climbed higher still, and our lives moved with it in their familiar, peaceful rhythm. I kept my eyes half closed, savoring the last moments of stillness. The inundation season, the Ake, was approaching, and with it came a different rhythm to all our lives. The fields would soon disappear beneath the water, and for a time we would rest from the work of sowing and harvesting. The river would reclaim its ancient right, spreading itself across the valley like a great, breathing creature returning home. Even after a lifetime of witnessing this cycle, the moment just before it began always filled me with a soft, quiet sense of wonder. Slowly, the eastern darkness began to pale. I rose from my mat, wrapped my linen shawl around my shoulders, and stepped carefully across the cool, earthen floor. My family still slept, my brother curled at the far end of the room, my mother and father breathing in slow harmony. I moved lightly so as not to disturb them and lifted the wooden bar from the door. Outside, dawn hovered at the edge of the horizon. The sky was a muted blend of gray and faint rose, and the silhouettes of our village's simple houses rested beneath it like peaceful animals. A few clay lamps still glowed near doorways where early risers tended their morning chores. I could hear gentle voices here and there, the soft bleat of a goat, the scratch of reeds as someone swept the ground. I stepped into the cool air and inhaled deeply. The scents of the land were crisp at this hour, moisture rising from the earth, crushed herbs from yesterday's work, smoke lingering from small cooking fires that had been extinguished during the night. These were scents familiar from childhood, yet every flood season they carried a deeper meaning, as though they whispered of ancient memories stretching far beyond my lifetime. I walked along the worn footpath leading toward the river. The fields beside it were dark shapes, still undisturbed by the waters that would soon occupy them. Some farmers had placed small markers, sticks, stones, woven reed ties, indicating the rows where barley and emmer wheat had grown. Soon those markers would be swallowed by the rising Nile, but for now they stood like reminders of the work completed in the seasons before. As I neared the riverbank, the faint murmur of flowing water reached my ears. The Nile never truly slept, but its tone changed with the seasons. Now, its voice carried a low, patient promise, the subtle sound of a great body gathering itself far to the south. I felt the familiar flutter in my chest, a blend of anticipation and calm. Reaching the bank, I crouched beside the water and dipped my fingers into its surface. The temperature was cool, almost startling, but soothing. The river felt alive beneath my touch, as though stirring after a long slumber. Across the water, the opposite bank was faintly visible, softened by the early morning mist. Palm trees and papyrus reeds rose from the shadows, their forms gently swaying. Soon, families from the village would come to observe the water, bringing small offerings or simply standing quietly as tradition dictated. But this early hour was mine alone, and I cherished it. I closed my eyes and let the faint sounds sink into me, the whisper of reeds, the shifting current, the distant call of a water bird beginning its day. When I opened my eyes again, the sky had begun to lighten more noticeably. The first true rays of dawn brushed across the river's surface, turning it from a dark ribbon into a shimmering sheet of silver. My mother often said that the river reflected the moods of the sun, and on mornings like this, I believed her. I rose, brushed the dampness from my fingers, and started back toward the village. As I walked, more people stirred. A woman stepped out of her doorway carrying a clay jar. Two boys chased each other between the houses, their laughter soft but quick. Smoke drifted from newly lit fires, carrying with it the scent of bread dough warming on flat stones. Life in the village always felt gentler at the beginning of Ake, as though the river's slow approach encouraged everyone to move with care. By the time I reached home, the sun's rim had appeared above the horizon. Its light fell across the village in a golden sweep, illuminating the mud brick walls, the thatched roofs, the carefully laid clay jars that caught the dew. My father stood near the entrance of our house, adjusting the leather strap of a basket slung over his shoulder. He was preparing to join the other men who would walk along the banks today, taking note of how far the water had moved overnight. "You were up early," he said, noticing the faint dampness on my hands. His voice was low but warm, carrying the calm authority of someone who had lived many seasons by the river. "I wanted to see the first signs," I replied. He nodded. "It is a good habit. The river teaches patience. It always has." My mother stepped out behind him, tying her hair back with a linen cord. "Come, Merritt," she said. "Help me with the morning bread. There is still much to prepare before the water rises fully." We worked together in the small courtyard behind our home. The flour jar stood near the wall, its lid covered by a fresh cloth to keep out insects. I helped my mother mix the dough, kneading it with slow, steady motions that eased my mind. The rhythm of my hands pressing into the soft mixture formed a gentle cadence that matched the quiet beat of the morning. As the dough baked on hot stones beneath a clay pot, the smell filled the courtyard. My brother emerged from the house, rubbing his eyes and stretching like a cat. He sat near us and watched with a sleepy half-smile. "Do you think the river will come high this year?" he asked. "It's too early to know," my mother replied, brushing flour from her hands. "But the stars and winds have been generous. The priests in the town say the southern rains were strong. We will see." My father returned a short while later, carrying his basket now filled with small smooth stones. He often collected them when walking by the river, a habit he said helped him feel connected to the land. He placed the basket beside the doorway and joined us for bread and water. "It has begun," he said. "Slowly. The outer banks are marked. Perhaps in a day or two we'll see the first true reach." A quiet excitement flickered through me. Even though this happened every year, each season felt like its own story unfolding. The river rose with the precision of a ritual yet carried the uniqueness of the present moment. After the meal, the village gradually transitioned into the day's work. Families whose homes sat on lower ground prepared to move some items to safety. Weavers worked to finish cloth before the humidity increased. Children fetched water and helped their elders carry tools, baskets, and jars to higher shelves. My own tasks varied with the season. During Ake, when fields were underwater, I often helped repair storage vessels, patch baskets, or mix mud for small repairs to houses. That morning, I gathered reeds from the edge of the village to begin weaving a new mat. Sitting beneath the shade of a palm tree, I let the reeds slip through my fingers, feeling their smooth yet resilient texture. The method was simple but required focus: align the reeds, fold, interlace, and tighten. Over time, a pattern emerged, evidence of patience turned into something useful. As the sun climbed higher, the warm air carried the first hints of moisture rising from the floodplain. A faint shimmer appeared over the fields, blurring the line between land and water. I paused my weaving to look. The sight never failed to calm me, the way the distant earth seemed to breathe, exhaling warmth and inhaling the cooling wind from the river. Around midday, I joined my mother near the communal grinding area. Women gathered there, some seated on low stools, others kneeling over stone querns. Their hands moved rhythmically as they ground grain into flour, the sound of stone against stone forming a steady background hum. Conversations flowed easily, gentle teasing, shared stories, small observations about the coming flood. One woman spoke of seeing ibis birds gathering earlier than usual, a good sign. Another mentioned that her husband believed the water would rise higher than last year because of the scent of the eastern winds. My mother offered her own thought, that the color of the water held clues, and she had seen a deeper hue that morning, suggesting rich silt. I listened quietly, weaving the strands of their words into my understanding of the season. Knowledge in our village did not come from a single source but from many voices, each carrying pieces of truth gathered over a lifetime. As the afternoon stretched on, I resumed my weaving under the shade of another palm. Children played nearby, splashing in a shallow channel where water had begun to seep in. Their laughter blended with the soft rustling of palm fronds overhead. Occasionally, a bird would swoop low and land near the water's edge, dipping its beak and shaking droplets into the air. Hours passed in calm progression, the sunlight shifting from bright gold to a softer tone. When the heat began to ease, I stood and carried the partially woven mat back home. The sky had begun to tint toward evening, the colors warming into shades of amber and muted red. My father returned from the riverbank, his footsteps unhurried but certain. The water moved again, he said. More than yesterday. You should come see it tomorrow. I nodded, feeling a gentle anticipation settle in my chest. The rhythm of the Nile's rise was not fast, but it demanded attention, like an elder telling a story slowly. Each day brought a small detail that added meaning to the next. We ate dinner together, lentils stewed with herbs, bread, and dates. The flavors were simple, familiar, comforting. As we ate, my father spoke softly of his youth, of flood seasons he remembered from when Pharaoh Amenhotep was still a young man. My mother added her own memories, describing how the river seemed to shimmer differently in different years, how some floods brought more water birds than others. Their voices soothed me as much as the food. I felt wrapped in the continuity of their stories, as though each word linked the present moment to countless moments before. After the meal, I climbed onto the roof with my brother to catch the evening breeze. The sky was a deepening blue, the first stars emerging with delicate clarity. The air smelled of moisture, silt, and distant reeds. We lay side by side, looking up at the vastness above us. The river is like the sky, my brother said quietly. It moves even when we don't see it. I smiled. Yes. And it brings us what we need, just as the stars bring us signs. We fell silent, letting the soft murmurs of the night fill our ears, crickets, distant frogs, the faint calling of birds settling into their nests. Below us, the village dimmed as lamps were extinguished one by one. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the cool air wash over me. My thoughts drifted lazily, carrying the images of the day, the shimmering fields, the deepening color of the river, the texture of reeds beneath my fingers, the soft rhythm of grinding stones. Eventually, sleep found me gently. And when I woke again, the second day of the flood season had begun. The third morning of Ake arrived with a quiet clarity that I had always cherished. Before the sun had yet risen, the sky carried a faint, pale glow that softened everything it touched. I woke gently, not to any noise or disturbance, but to the subtle shift of light filtering through the narrow opening in the wall of our home. I lay for a moment on my mat, allowing the calm of the early hour to settle over me. My body felt rested, my breathing slow and even. Somewhere outside, a single bird called, its voice drifting lightly on the breeze. My wife stirred beside me, adjusting her linen covering. The soft rustle of the fabric blended with the distant murmur of the river, a sound that now seemed ever present even from within the village. The water had risen another measure overnight. I knew it without even stepping outside. I could feel it in the air's increased dampness, in the faint smell of reed beds that drifted on the breeze. Ake permeated everything, not in a sudden or overwhelming way, but like a slow tide that touched every sense gently and patiently. I rose quietly, careful not to wake the children. My son was curled on his mat with his arm tucked under his head, while my daughter Merit slept in the small loft space she preferred, where night breezes often slipped through the roof thatch. I lifted the wooden bar of the door and stepped outside. Dawn's earliest light stretched across the village, revealing the soft outlines of mud brick houses, palm trunks, and the faint gleam of clay jars left outside to dry. A few neighbors were already awake, though most homes remained still. The air carried that delicate mixture of scents that only existed in this season, the moisture rising from the floodplain, the earthy breath of soaked soil, the faint sweetness of river grass, and the thin smoke from early cooking fires. I inhaled deeply and began walking toward the raised path that led to the river. My feet felt the coolness of the ground, still holding the night's lingering chill. Each step carried me closer to the faint sound of water moving through channels that hadn't existed a week before. The Nile stretched itself across the land without rush or force, filling shallow depressions, seeping into old furrows, flowing around knolls of earth left intentionally higher by generations past. As I walked, I saw that the water had reached the outer edges of the lower houses. Not dangerously, but certainly closer than before. My father once told me that in the old days, before homes had been built with wiser planning, there were years when entire clusters had to be moved each season. Now, the villages knew their places, listening to the subtle patterns of the flood cycle. When I reached the riverbank, I paused, taking in the quiet expanse before me. The water had spread far into the fields, creating a tranquil inland lake where paths, markers, and furrows had recently been visible. Only the tops of a few taller boundary ridges remained above the shimmering surface, small islands of dry earth in a sea of moving silver. The river's voice had deepened. Not louder, but fuller, like a low, warm hum that resonated in the air. Lines of ripples stretched outward from unseen currents beneath the surface. Far to the left, a small school of fish darted near a cluster of reeds, sending tiny waves across the reflection of the brightening sky. I stepped closer, careful not to slip in the soft mud. It was darker now, saturated with water and rich silt carried from the far south. I bent down and dipped my hand in. The water was cooler than I expected, almost bracing. It felt alive, as though the river's entire journey rested in those few fingertips. Already so high, I murmured to myself. Behind me, I heard the gentle crunch of footsteps. When I turned, I saw Merritt approaching, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders and her hair tied loosely behind her head. Her face held that steady calm she always seemed to carry during this season, a calm that reminded me of her mother, though softened by youth and quiet thoughtfulness. "You're early," she said, though her tone carried no surprise. "As are you," I replied. "The water draws us both." She nodded and came to stand beside me. We looked out at the submerged fields together, the quietness between us comfortable and familiar. A few birds skimmed the water's surface, their wings catching the new light. The sky behind them grew brighter, streaked with soft shades of gold and lavender. "The river is generous this year," Merritt said softly. "Look at the silt. It's darker than I've seen in many seasons." I glanced at her. "You've learned to read its signs well." She shrugged with a modest smile. "You taught me to watch, and the river taught me the rest." Her words warmed me. There were times when I wondered what the future would bring her. Would she remain in the village, marry, tend the fields, and raise children of her own? Or would she choose something different, perhaps to accompany traders or scribes traveling between the cities? But this was not the season for wondering too far ahead. Ake was a season of being present, of accepting the river's pace. We stood together a while longer, watching the slow expansion of water. The sun finally crested the horizon fully, flooding the land with rich light. The river gleamed, and the air warmed. By the time we walked back to the village, more people had emerged from their homes. The sound of grinding stones grew louder as women prepared the morning bread. Children ran along the higher paths, pointing excitedly at places where water now reached the bases of date palms. Men gathered near the edge of the village to discuss where temporary footbridges might be placed over deeper channels. I joined my family for the morning meal, warm flatbread, figs, and fresh water from the large clay jar near the door. My wife listened as the children spoke excitedly about the expanding flood. She smiled, though her eyes lingered thoughtfully on the door. "Will you go inspect the far bank today?" she asked me as she handed me more bread. "Yes," I said. "The men are meeting near the granary. We'll walk the higher ground and see how the water spreads beyond the ridge." "Be careful," she said gently. "The mud is soft in some places." Her concern was familiar, and I placed my hand briefly on hers. "I will." After the meal, I gathered a few tools and joined the other men at the granary. We set out in a group of 6, each carrying a walking staff to test the ground before stepping. The sun climbed higher, warm but not yet harsh. The air shimmered faintly over the flooded areas, the reflection of the sky creating a wide band of brightness across the land. As we moved along the raised paths, I felt the familiar rhythm of walking during flood season, the careful placement of each step, the testing of ground, the shared caution of the men around me. Some joked lightly as we walked, while others spoke in low tones about previous years and how the waters had behaved. The older men carried more memories, and we listened when they spoke. "The color of the water is good," one of them said. "See how the edges are still clear with silt settling quickly. This means the current is not too strong here. And the fish are plentiful," another added. I saw 3 boats heading out before dawn. "They will return heavy." We walked on, stopping occasionally to mark water levels on wooden stakes or small stones. Such markers were simple but invaluable when comparing day to day. In one place, the water had risen more than expected. The ground dipped gently in that area, and the flood had taken advantage of the slope. "We should place reeds here," one man said. "A barrier, just enough to slow the flow." I nodded, making a mental note to return later with more reeds. The work during Ake was not heavy, but it required attention. Small actions prevented larger issues. We continued until midday, then rested under the shade of a line of palms. The breeze off the water cooled our faces, and we shared dried dates and water. While the others talked, I looked at the vastness of the flooded fields, feeling the same quiet awe that had filled me as a child. The river stretched far beyond what my eyes could trace, and somewhere far south, it continued to swell with the rains of distant lands. As the afternoon progressed, we made our way back to the village. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the raised paths. Women tended to chores in the shaded courtyards, and children splashed in shallow pools near the village edge. A pair of fishermen pulled their small reed boat along one of the deeper channels, their movements slow and practiced. When I returned home, I found my wife washing vegetables near the doorway. Merritt sat beside her, weaving with careful focus, while my son played nearby with a small clay figure he had made. I felt the gentle familiarity of the scene settle over me like a warm cloth. We shared our evening meal together as the sky deepened into dusky orange. The smell of cooked lentils filled the room, and my son leaned against me sleepily. Afterward, I stepped outside to take a final look at the land. The flooded fields shimmered under the rising moon, their surfaces glass-like and still. Firelight flickered from several doorways. The sounds of frogs and insects formed a soft chorus carried on the breeze. I stood there for some time, listening to the quiet breathing of the land. When I finally returned inside and lay on my mat, the heaviness of the day settled comfortably into my muscles. The house was dim, only the faintest light coming from the dying embers of the hearth. My eyes closed without effort. The river and sky overlapped in my thoughts, 2 vast mirrors reflecting one another, each holding the slow, patient rhythm that guided our lives. I let that rhythm fill me completely. Sleep came like the tide, gradual, cooling, certain. The morning of the 4th week of Ak began with an unusual softness, as though the world itself were wrapped gently in layers of pale light. When I woke on my mat, the house still held the cool air of night, and the faintest breeze slipped through the narrow opening near the roof. I lay still for a moment, letting my senses adjust to the quiet. No hard sounds, no hurried footsteps, only the tranquil merging of shadows and morning light. My wife slept peacefully, her breathing slow, her face relaxed. My daughter Merritt and my young son were curled under their linens nearby, their small shapes rising and falling gently. For a few heartbeats, I simply watched them in the dimness, appreciating the simple stillness of that moment, just before the village woke, just before duties and movement found us again. Eventually, I rose, careful not to disturb anyone. I stepped outside and felt the cool ground beneath my feet. The sky above the village was a muted gradient, fading from dusky gray at the horizon to soft gold higher up. The sun had not yet broken the line of the earth, but its coming was unmistakable. The silhouettes of palm trees and mud brick homes stood against that early glow like peaceful sentinels. A few other early risers moved quietly among the houses. A man carrying 2 clay jars walked toward the well with slow, balanced steps. A woman wrapped in a shawl swept the ground outside her home, her reed broom making gentle brushing noises. A goat bleated once, then settled again. The village was awakening in a slow, unhurried rhythm, as it always did during the flood season. I walked down the familiar path toward the river. The water had reached its peak days earlier and now began its subtle retreat, a process that was even slower than the rise. The retreat was like a long sigh from the land, drawn out over days and weeks, never rushed, never forced. It was just another breath in the ancient rhythm of the flood. When I reached the riverbank, the changes were immediately visible. The water still covered much of the plains, but the very edges showed hints of soft, dark earth re-emerging. Thin lines along the shallower areas marked where the river had begun to pull back. A small mound of earth that had been submerged before now stood in the open, glistening with moisture under the dawn light. A heron stood atop that newly surfaced mound, perfectly still, its long neck extended as it watched the water below. It seemed to sense the retreat as keenly as we did, aware that soon small fish would be trapped in shallow pockets, making its work easier. The bird's presence felt like a sign, another subtle reminder of how every creature lived according to the river's breath. I crouched at the edge of the bank and dipped my hand into the water. It was warmer now than it had been weeks earlier. The heat of the sun had begun to sink into the flooded surface, softening its coolness. Silt swirled gently around my fingers, tiny grains carried toward the fields where soon we would walk and sow the next season's life. As I watched the flow drift away, I felt someone approach behind me. Turning my head, I saw my son, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, but clearly determined not to miss this part of the season. He always came when the retreat began, eager to see where land would reappear and how the fields would reshape themselves. "You woke early," I said softly. "I didn't want to miss the first dry patch," he answered, pointing at the glistening mound where the heron stood. I smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "There will be many more in the days ahead. The river is beginning its walk back to its heart." He nodded thoughtfully, as though trying to imagine the river's heart, a mystery we spoke of often but knew we would likely never see. We stood side by side, watching as light slowly strengthened over the water. The sky shifted from soft gold to pale blue, and the palm trees began to glow with the sun's first full touch. The village behind us stirred more actively now. Voices drifted through the air, low conversations, greetings, the clatter of clay bowls being moved. My daughter Merit came toward us along the raised path, her shawl draped around her shoulders and her hair tied loosely. She smiled when she saw us. "Mother sent me to bring you back for bread," she said, stepping carefully along the damp patches of soil. "We were just coming," I replied, and together the three of us walked back toward our home. Breakfast was simple: warm flatbread, dates, and fresh water. We sat together in a circle, eating slowly as the sun filled the room. My wife's smile was warm, touched by the peace of the morning. Even though much of the village work paused during the flood season, the days still felt full not with labor, but with the quiet observation of change, the careful preparation for what would come. As the morning unfolded, villagers began gathering near the granary to discuss the retreat. I joined them, leaning on my walking staff. The elders pointed to where paths would need clearing once the water fully drained, where silt would be thickest and most fertile, and where shallow pools might remain longer than usual. Beck, the oldest among us, tapped the ground with his staff. "In 2 days," he said, "that mound near the date palms will be large enough to walk on." "Yes," another man replied. "And the deeper channel will remain for longer. We may be able to fish there for weeks." These discussions were unhurried, but their importance was clear. The retreat determined the next season's success. We listened carefully to the elders' observations, their memories guiding our understanding. They had seen more floods than any of us, their knowledge built from decades of careful watching. After the gathering, I walked to the elevated courtyard where my wife and Merit were sorting dried herbs. They organized the bundles by type: mint, garlic leaves, small flowering plants whose scent could soothe fever or settle a restless stomach. The breeze carried their fragrances lightly. My daughter glanced up as I approached. "You'll be checking the far channel today?" "Yes," I answered. "A few of the men are coming. The water there drains faster." "Be careful," my wife said softly. "The ground may be soft." Her concern warmed me, as it always did. I nodded. "I will." When the sun was high, I joined 4 other men and we took one of the reed boats toward the far channel. Our movements were slow and easy, each of us using a long pole to guide the boat. The water around us shimmered, reflecting the bright sky. Fish darted just below the surface, disturbed momentarily by the pole pressing into shallow ground. Birds flew overhead, their calls echoing softly. Some circled, waiting for the moment the water receded enough to reveal trapped fish. Others perched among branches that now rose directly from the water, their roots submerged but their leaves reaching toward the sun. As we reached the far channel, we saw that the water level had already dropped slightly. The exposed edges revealed thick, dark silt, the kind we prized most. One of the men knelt in the boat and reached out to test the ground with his pole. "Still too soft," he said, "but by tomorrow the edges may support our weight." We spent a long while traveling through the more distant areas of the floodplain, noting where water pooled and where it thinned. Everything moved slowly in this season. There was no urgency, only patient watching, gentle drifting, thoughtful preparation. When we returned to the village, the afternoon light had mellowed into a warm, amber hue. I walked home through the narrow paths, nodding to neighbors who busied themselves repairing mats, polishing wooden tools, or making small reed baskets for the coming planting. My son ran to meet me, excitement bright in his eyes. "We saw frogs in the shallow pool near the granary," he exclaimed. "And 2 ibis birds almost caught one." I chuckled. The birds always come closer this time of year. The land is generous to them. He nodded eagerly and took my hand as we walked the final stretch home. My wife and daughter were preparing the evening meal, lentils, garlic, and herbs in a small clay pot, simmering over the low fire. The smell filled the house, warm and comforting. We ate together as the day faded into night. The soft glow of the oil lamp cast gentle shadows across the walls. Merritt spoke quietly about a dream she had had the night before, a dream of the river turning into a path of light. My wife smiled at her description, saying that dreams during Ake often carried the river's voice. As night deepened, I stepped outside again. The sky above was a vast expanse of stars, so clear and brilliant that they seemed closer than usual. The cool air drifted over the land, bringing with it the scent of wet earth. I walked a short distance, standing at the edge of the floodplain. The water lay still now, reflecting the moon like a sheet of smooth metal. The retreat had begun in earnest. In the coming days, the change would be more obvious. But tonight, it held that perfect stillness, neither rising nor falling, only resting. I closed my eyes and let the sounds wash over me, the chorus of frogs, the distant movement of reeds, the soft hum of insects. My breathing slowed. My body relaxed. Each sound felt like part of a larger rhythm, a rhythm older than any memory, older than any written record. When I opened my eyes again, the moon had climbed higher. The light stretched across the water, illuminating the first patches of earth emerging from beneath the flood. Small islands, soon to be fields. I returned home and lay on my mat, the cool linen soft beneath me. The house was quiet, my family already asleep. I let my thoughts drift like a small boat on the river's surface. I thought of seasons past, of my father's memories, of the stories elders told of great floods and gentle ones. I thought of my children growing into the rhythm of the land, learning to read the sky and water, understanding that our lives were tied to this slow breathing of earth and river. My eyes grew heavy. My body settled more deeply into the mat. The lamp flickered once, then dimmed. The shadows softened into a single, warm darkness. And as sleep came over me, it came the way the river rose, softly, slowly, surely, carrying me into its timeless, peaceful depth.